Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of Robert Hazlitt, better known as the highwayman of Gateshead Fell. I hope you will find this story interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this story, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. Robert Hazlitt was hanged for the crime of robbery in 1770, and he was known as the highwayman of Gateshead Fell. For the main part of this story, I will refer to him as the highwayman. Little or nothing is known of the early life of Robert. 1770 is quite a long way back to go for research when no other family members are known. Hazlitt is also quite likely not to be his real name. This is possibly Robert Hudson. It is not clear if he was ever married or if he had any children. However, several years later it was said that a man by the name of Mr. Doubleday wrote a book, though there was no details of what this book was about, but in the book he claimed that Robert was his father. Whether this was true or not is almost impossible to tell. But if anyone listening does know anything more about the life of Robert Hazlitt or Hudson, do please let me know in the comments. Robert claimed that he had previously worked in London as a clerk for a man by the name of Mr. Samuel Bamford. However, he had lost his job, although he gives no reasons why, and had then decided that he would travel to the northeast to look for work. He arrived in the northeast in late July of 1770. And although he did look for work, he was not able to find any, and after only a week he was beginning to worry that his money would run out. It was at this point that he decided to hire a horse, although some reports suggest that he actually bought a horse with the last of his money, and this would seem to be the first indication of his move from a normal everyday person into a life of crime as a highwayman. However, some articles have suggested that he may have been a professional criminal and that this was not the first time he had tried his hand at highway robbery. But whatever the truth was, he had certainly decided this was what he was going to do, having not been able to get a normal job. Gateshead Fell at the time was described as being nothing more than a wild common, and many people avoided travelling there at night, and would most certainly not travel there alone during the daytime either, unless they simply had no choice. It seems it was a place that people avoided if possible. In early August of 1770, a lady by the name of Margaret Benson was travelling in the area on her way home from a day out. She was travelling in her post-chaise. This is a type of carriage which usually had a horse and rider at the front, so she would not have been on her own. It was a summer's evening, but it was close to dusk, and on looking out of the carriage window she saw to her horror that the driver of her post-chaise was being held up by a real-life highwayman. Within moments he was opening her carriage door, and he then pointed a gun at the startled woman and demanded her watch, money, and any other valuables that she had with her. Margaret Benson was quite a clever lady. She told the robber that she did not own a watch and had no valuables with her, and that what little money she did have she had spent on her trip, and that all she had was half a guinea. This was roughly 10 shillings at the time, and in today's money it would be around £82. The robber did not seem to be totally convinced, but he took the money, and Margaret and her driver were able to carry on their way home. They had not travelled far when they came across the local mailman. Post was not delivered by coach in those days. It was often sent out with a man on foot or on horseback, which was the case here. The mailman would usually be carrying cloth mail bags. Margaret warned him of the highwayman. She said the man seemed to be very nervous and had been shaken quite a lot when he had robbed her. Perhaps she was seeing this as a sign that he could do something crazy due to his nerves. The mailman, whose name is not mentioned in any of the articles I have seen, felt that he could not turn back and must continue on with his journey. But he did take notice of Margaret's warning, and he called into a house along the way to see if he could get himself a gun for protection. However, he was unable to get one, but decided to carry on with his journey in the hope that the highwayman would have long since moved on elsewhere and that he would now be safe. It was not long before the mailman came across what he believed was another traveller on the road just up ahead of him. When he caught up to him, he warned the man of the highwayman in the area, and he even told him that he had tried but had been unable to get himself a gun. The mailman felt that the traveller he had just met was a very jolly, friendly man, and the two decided to travel on a little further together. However, they had not travelled far when the jolly traveller suddenly turned and pointed a gun at the mailman and demanded that he gave him the bags of mail he was carrying. It was, of course, at this point that the mailman realised his mistake, and that this was no traveller but the highwayman he had been warned about by Margaret Benson. It was too late to do anything now, and the highwayman told him to throw the mailbags onto the ground and to turn his horse around so that he could not see the direction that he went in when he left. He did as he was told, and luckily again the highwayman left, and the mailman was able to then head back to the town he had come from. He immediately went to the police and told them what had happened. He told them how the highwayman seemed to become very nervous when he had been pointing the gun at him. Margaret had also been to the police and told them a similar story. Whether the highwayman had been wearing a mask or not was not stated in any of the reports, but it seems that both Margaret Benson and the mailman were able to give quite a detailed description of him. Meanwhile, the highwayman had carried his ill-gotten gains to a quiet spot on the fell and checked to see what spoils he had got. He took out whatever items he thought he would be able to get money for and hid most of the other items on the fell. It can only be assumed that he intended to come back for them at a later date. He did not leave the fell straight away, as he then tried to rob another post-chaise just a short time after robbing the mailman. However, the carriage was empty and the rider had little or nothing worth taking, so he let him pass. The highwayman then decided to travel on to Newcastle. It was in Newcastle that he was very quickly caught and arrested. Perhaps he looked suspicious, or perhaps the description given by both Margaret and the mailman had been so good that he had been easily spotted on his arrival. When searched, he was found to still have many of the stolen items in his possession. He was sent to trial within the week and found himself before a judge by the name of Baron Perrott. By now, the highwayman was known by his real name of Robert Hazlitt, or Hudson, and also the highwayman of Gateshead Fell. As luck would have it, though not for Robert, Baron Perrott felt absolutely certain that the man before him was the same man who had robbed him when he had been in London recently. Robert pleaded not guilty to each crime of robbery. There are sadly no trial details or any details of what his defence may have been. However, one thing that was mentioned by Robert was that he claimed he had not been the person to rob Margaret or the mailman, and that it had in fact been a man by the name of Hewitt, and that the man Hewitt had given Robert some of the stolen items from the mailbags. Hewitt was someone who was clearly very well known, and he was quickly found, and it was proven that he had been nowhere near the area at the time the crimes were committed. So Robert was then found guilty of all the crimes of robbery and sentenced to death by hanging. Some of the missing items from the mailbags had not yet been found, but after the trial, and after being found guilty, Robert sent a note to the judge telling him where the missing items could be found, and they were swiftly recovered, and this proved for certain that Robert was indeed the guilty man, as no one else could have possibly known where they had been hidden. Robert Hazlitt was hanged on the 18th of September 1770 somewhere in Durham. Unfortunately, the exact location is unknown, but back in the 1700s, hangings would take place in many different locations, as no one single spot was used, as would be the case for hangings in later years. Bodies were still left for 1 hour after the hanging before they would be removed. After this, his body was taken to Gateshead Fell, where a gibbet had been erected, and his remains were hung in chains some 20 feet above the ground, close to the spot where he had robbed both Margaret and the mailman. It was said that all the time the body was in the gibbet, people would come from miles around to see it, and even when the body had decayed to the point that a powerful smell would penetrate the air all around it, people still came to see it. There are no details as to how long he was left hanging there, and no details about what happened after his body was removed. Was he buried somewhere? Well, it seems that that is something we might never know. It is said in some stories that an area close to the gibbet became known as Hazlitt's Well. However, I found a map while I was researching this story, and that seems to call the area Hazlitt's Pond. But of course the name may have been changed over the years as the story was passed from person to person like Chinese whispers. Back then it seems that people had a fascination with crimes and criminals, and gibbets were, it seems, very popular places to visit, but I have to say that it is not something that I would have wanted to see. Stories do suggest that people continued to visit the area long after Robert Hazlitt was removed, until eventually the land was sold and it seems that allotments were placed on the site. Sadly, I have not been able to truly work out the location, even with 2 different maps, as both were very old and the area has changed a lot since the time of the crimes. Unless, of course, anyone listening to this thinks they know for sure where his body was hung, I'd really love to know. An article appeared in the newspapers a few years later discussing how hanging bodies like Robert's in gibbets really did not do anything to deter crime, as many more cases had been tried in the following years for similar or worse crimes. Instead, it seems that bodies in gibbets were treated as tourist attractions, and even, in some very odd cases, places to sit and have a picnic. This last part really does make me wonder. I hope you have found this sad and somewhat gruesome in places story of the Gateshead highwayman interesting. There are no questions to ask, as Robert was clearly guilty of the crimes he was charged with, but do you think his punishment fitted the crime? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.